Eleanor gasped, spinning around. "Oh my goodness! Mr. Ashworth, are you all right?" The sound of the shattering crystal glass had been like a gunshot in the cavernous, silent penthouse. Now, a splash of deep crimson was spreading across the pristine white marble floor, the puddle reflecting the glittering city lights from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Shards of glass lay scattered like diamonds in the mess. It was expensive wine. The bottle cost more than Eleanor's monthly rent, and it was now soaking into the pristine floor she had polished just an hour ago. Her heart hammered against her ribs. One moment, he had been standing by the counter, staring out at the city. The next, a crash. She had been across the room, carefully wiping down the chrome legs of a modernistic stool. Nowhere near him. It couldn't have been her fault. It was impossible. Julian Ashworth turned from the window, his handsome face a perfect mask of cold, mild surprise. He was a man who seemed sculpted from the same expensive, unforgiving materials as his penthouse. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his gray suit tailored so precisely it looked more like an extension of his body than mere clothing. He looked down at the puddle of wine, then his gaze drifted to Eleanor, his eyes lingering on the dark red stain that had splattered onto the hem of her simple blue uniform. A small, cruel smile touched the corner of his mouth. "It seems you were careless, Eleanor," he said, his voice smooth as silk but sharp as the broken glass. "You must have bumped the counter. What a mess you've made." The accusation hung in the air, cold and heavy. Eleanor froze, the polishing cloth still in her hand. Her mind raced, trying to find the right words, the safe words. She knew this game. It was a game of power she was destined to lose. "Mr. Ashworth, I was on the other side of the room." "Really?" he purred, taking a slow, deliberate step towards her. He was a predator closing in on its prey. "Are you contradicting me? In my own home?" The fight drained from Eleanor's eyes, extinguished by the familiar, weary resignation of a woman who had fought too many battles and couldn't afford to lose this one. She needed this job. Her daughter Maya needed this job. Her gaze dropped to the floor, to the mess she was now responsible for. "No, sir," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "You're right. It was my fault. I'm so sorry. I'll clean it up immediately." "See that you do," he said, his voice dripping with the quiet satisfaction of a king who had just proven his divine right. He turned to walk toward his office, dismissing her, the entire incident already forgotten, a minor amusement in his day. He was done with his toy. But from the pantry just off the main living area, a small, clear voice cut through the tense silence. "No, she won't." Julian Ashworth stopped dead in his tracks. He turned around slowly, his perfectly composed expression faltering for the first time, replaced by a flicker of genuine surprise. Then, annoyance. 12-year-old Maya Hayes stepped out of the shadows of the pantry doorway. She was small for her age, with her mother's determined chin and wide, intelligent eyes. Her small fists were clenched at her sides, and those eyes, usually soft and curious, were now blazing with a fire that billionaires and kings weren't used to seeing. Eleanor's heart stopped. "Maya, no," she breathed, a frantic, terrified hiss. "Go back." Now. But Maya's gaze was locked on the billionaire. She took another step forward, her sneakers silent on the polished floor. "You did it on purpose," she said, her voice trembling but unbroken, ringing with the absolute certainty of a child who has just witnessed a profound injustice. "You spilled it to be mean to my mom. You're a liar, and you should be the one to clean it up." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier and colder than the marble floor, a thick, suffocating blanket of disbelief. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She looked from her daughter's defiant stance to Mr. Ashworth's thunderous expression. His face, which had been a mask of cold amusement, was now hardening into something far more dangerous. The game had been interrupted. A pawn had spoken out of turn. Julian Ashworth's eyes, the color of a winter storm, narrowed on the small girl standing before him. He was not a man who was accustomed to being challenged, least of all by the daughter of his maid. He took a slow step forward, looming over Maya, a giant of wealth and power before a child, armed with nothing but the truth. The cruel smile returned to his lips, but this time it held no amusement. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed a new, more interesting toy to break. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Maya flinched but held her ground. She lifted her chin, meeting his icy stare. "I said you should clean it up," she repeated, her voice a little quieter but just as firm. "And you should say you're sorry." Eleanor felt the world tilt. Her daughter's words echoed in the vast, silent room, a declaration of war that they could not possibly win. She rushed forward, grabbing Maya's small, bony shoulder. "Maya, be quiet. Apologize to Mr. Ashworth right now." Her voice was a desperate, trembling plea. "I'm so sorry, sir. She's a child. She doesn't understand what she's saying." Julian Ashworth didn't even glance at Eleanor. His stormy gray eyes remained fixed on Maya, a strange, calculating light dawning in them. The anger was still there, a cold, hard knot behind his gaze, but it was being overlaid with something else, a perverse curiosity. He straightened up, a slow, condescending smile spreading across his face. "Oh, I think she understands perfectly," he said, his voice a low purr. He crouched down, not in a gesture of friendliness, but like a predator lowering its center of gravity. He brought himself face to face with Maya. "You have a strong sense of justice, don't you? You believe in right and wrong, truth and lies." Maya swallowed hard, but didn't look away. "My mom taught me not to lie." "Did she?" Julian's smile widened. He glanced up at Eleanor's terrified face. "Did she also teach you that in the real world, the truth is a luxury? That justice is a commodity, bought and sold by people like me?" He looked back at Maya. "Your mother understands. She knows that to survive, sometimes you must swallow the truth, smile, and clean up the messes that powerful men make. That is the price of her job, the price of the roof over your head." Each word was a deliberate poisoned dart aimed at the heart of their dignity. He was dissecting their powerlessness and laying it bare for them to see. "That's not right," Maya whispered, her voice shaking. "Right has nothing to do with it," Julian said, standing up again, towering over them. "It's about value. Your mother provides a service I value. Therefore, I pay her. You, on the other hand, have just proven to be a liability, an item with negative value." He began to pace slowly, his expensive shoes clicking ominously on the marble. Eleanor's heart sank. This was it. He was going to fire her. "Mr. Ashworth, please. I'll make sure she never comes here again." "She will never bother you." "I need this job." Julian stopped pacing and held up a hand, silencing her. "Oh, I'm not going to fire you, Eleanor." "That would be..." Uninspired, he looked back at Maya, a gleam in his eye. "And it would end our little conversation far too soon. No, I have a better idea. A teachable moment." He walked over to a sleek, minimalist desk and leaned against it, crossing his arms. The king was back on his throne. "You believe in fairness, little one. You believe liars should be punished. So let's play a game. Your mother's job will be the prize Eleanor's breath caught in her throat." "A game?" "A game of value," Julian clarified, his focus entirely on Maya. "I am a man who understands value. I see an asset, and I acquire it. I see a liability, and I cut it loose. You, with your misplaced courage, are a liability. But perhaps you have some hidden value. I'm willing to be convinced." He paused, letting the weight of his proposition settle in the room. "Here is my offer. You will continue to come here with your mother after school. Each week, I will present you with something I deem utterly worthless, an object with no value whatsoever. You will have until Friday to prove to me that it has value. If you succeed, your mother keeps her job for another week. If you fail..." He let the threat hang in the air. Unfinished, but perfectly understood. It was a monstrous proposal. A cruel, sadistic game designed to humiliate them week after week. It was a psychological torture rack, and he intended to strap her 12-year-old daughter into it. "No," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with a mixture of terror and outrage. "You can't do that. She's a child. Just fire me. Please. The offer is not for you, Eleanor," Julian said coldly. He looked at Maya. "It's for the little truth-teller. What do you say? Is your mother's job valuable enough to you to play my game?" He had trapped them completely. If Maya refused, her defiance would be the direct cause of her mother's unemployment. If she accepted, she was agreeing to be his plaything. He was forcing a child to gamble with their livelihood. Maya looked at her mother's pale, desperate face. She saw the fear in her eyes, the trembling of her hands. She understood the impossible position they were in. The weight of their world had just been placed on her small shoulders. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of expensive wine and fear. She thought of her mother working until her back ached, scrubbing the floors of a man who looked at her like she was dirt. All for her. For them. She turned back to Julian Ashworth, her small face set with a resolve that seemed far too old for her years. "I'll do it," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I'll play your game." A slow, triumphant smile spread across Julian's face. He had won. He had turned her courage against her. "Excellent," he said. He pushed himself off the desk and walked back toward the mess on the floor. He nudged a piece of the broken crystal with the toe of his polished shoe. "Then we shall begin on Monday," he said. "For now, Eleanor, you have a spill to clean up." He gave Maya one last cold look. "I do hope, for your sake, that you're as clever as you are brave." The weekend was a long, suffocating silence. Every time Eleanor looked at Maya, she felt a fresh wave of guilt and terror. Her daughter, who should have been worrying about math homework and sleepovers, was now carrying the weight of their survival. They spoke very little about what had happened. The fear was a living thing in their small apartment, too big to be contained by words. When they arrived at the penthouse on Monday afternoon, the air was thick with a new clinical tension. It was no longer a workplace. It was an arena. Julian Ashworth was waiting for them, not in his office, but standing in the middle of the vast living room. Beside him, on the gleaming marble floor, was a large, flat cardboard box. He smiled when he saw them. The same cold, predatory smile from Friday. "Ah, the contestants have arrived, punctual." I admire that Eleanor's hands were clammy. She gave Maya's shoulder a gentle squeeze, a silent message of support she wasn't sure she felt herself. Maya, however, walked forward and stood a few feet away from Mr. Ashworth, her school backpack still slung over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "Welcome to the first round of our little game, Maya," Julian said, his voice smooth and condescending. He gestured towards the box with a flick of his wrist. "Your first challenge awaits." He knelt and flipped open the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of tissue paper, was a tangled, brittle mess of brown and gray stalks. Atop the stalks were the sad, papery remains of what had once been flowers. They were orchids, dozens of them, all dead. The petals were withered and dry, the colors faded to a ghostly tan. They looked like the skeletons of flowers. "These were in the lobby of my main office building," Julian explained, standing up and brushing a speck of dust from his trousers. They were magnificent, white as fresh snow, but, as all beautiful things do, they died. Their value is now 0. In fact, it's negative. I have to pay someone to haul them to the garbage. They are, by every objective measure, worthless. He looked down at Maya, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Your task is to prove me wrong. You have until Friday at 5 p.m. to show me the value in this box of dead flowers. You may use any resources you can find in this penthouse. Glue, paper, whatever my staff has on hand. But you may not bring anything from the outside. The solution must be found within these walls." He was setting impossible rules, closing every door he could think of. "And what happens if I do it?" Maya asked, her voice small but steady. Julian chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "If you succeed, and that is a very big if, your mother will be permitted to continue her employment here for another week. We will then play again next week with a new item. And if I fail?" His smile vanished. "If you fail, I will expect your mother's keys on my desk, and you will both be escorted from the premises by security. Permanently. Is that clear?" "Yes," Maya whispered. "Good." He gave the box a gentle nudge with his foot. "The clock is ticking. You may begin." With that, he turned and strode into his office, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, leaving them alone with the box of floral corpses. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Eleanor stared at the dead orchids, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. It was an impossible, cruel task. He had given her a box of trash and demanded she turn it into treasure. It was a game designed for her to fail from the very beginning. "Maya, baby, we can just leave," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking. "We don't have to do this." "I'll find another job. We'll be okay." Maya didn't answer. She knelt beside the box and gently, almost reverently, lifted one of the withered stalks. A few dry, papery petals crumbled in her hand, turning to dust. She stared at the fragile remnants in her palm. He was right. They were dead. They were garbage. A knot of despair tightened in her stomach. How could she find value in something that had lost its very life? She looked around the vast, opulent room. Everything in it was perfect, new, and gleaming with value. The art on the walls was worth millions. The furniture was designed by famous artists. Even the air smelled expensive. This was a world that had no place for dead things. It was a world that discarded anything that was no longer perfect. Her gaze fell on her mother. Eleanor was trying to be strong, but Maya could see the raw fear in her eyes. She saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around her mouth. Her mother worked so hard to keep them afloat, to give them a life. She cleaned up the messes of a man who treated her with less respect than he treated his furniture. All for her. A quiet, fierce determination began to push back the despair. She wouldn't let him win. She couldn't. She looked back at the dead orchid in her hand. The petals were so delicate, almost like paper. She thought about a project she had done in art class last year. They had made collages from old magazines and colored paper. The teacher had told them that art wasn't just about making new things. It was about seeing old things in a new way. Beauty in what survives. The thought came to her suddenly, a whisper in the back of her mind. She looked at the petals again. The color was gone, but the shape was still there. The intricate veins, the delicate curves. It was a different kind of beauty. A fragile, quiet beauty. The beauty of a memory. An idea, small and tentative at first, began to form in her mind. It was a crazy idea, a long shot, but it was something. She stood up, her eyes scanning the penthouse. "Mom," she said, her voice gaining a new strength. "Does Mr. Ashworth have an art room, or a place where he keeps supplies? Glue, scissors, maybe some colored paper?" Eleanor looked at her, confused by the sudden shift in her tone. I think there's a supply closet down the hall from the main office, for presentations and things." "Why?" Maya looked back at the box of dead flowers, her mind racing. She no longer saw a box of trash. She saw a box of possibilities. She saw a palette of browns and grays and tans. She saw shapes and textures. "Because," Maya said, a flicker of a smile touching her lips for the first time that day, "I think I know how to show him what these are worth." For the next 3 days, a small, sunless utility closet became Maya's secret workshop. The space was barely large enough for a small work table and 2 stools, smelling faintly of lemon polish and floor wax. But to Maya, it was a sanctuary. After finding the supply closet, which was filled with high-end presentation materials, poster boards, markers, and expensive stationery, They had found what they needed: a pair of sharp scissors, a bottle of clear-drying craft glue, and a large, stiff sheet of black poster board. In a dusty storage room at the end of a service hallway, they found an even bigger treasure: a simple, discarded picture frame, its glass still intact. Eleanor cleaned the frame until it shone, her movements precise and focused. It was a simple task, but it felt like an act of rebellion. She was polishing their weapon. Maya worked with the focus of a surgeon. She carefully dismantled the dead orchids, separating the withered petals from the brittle stalks. She sorted them by size, shape, and the subtle variations in their faded colors, from pale ivory to a dusty brown, with hints of lavender and gray. To Julian Ashworth, it was a box of monochromatic trash. To Maya, it was a palette. Her little fingers, usually busy with a pencil or a book, moved with a newfound grace. She laid the black poster board on the table, a dark canvas for her creation. Using a pair of tweezers from her mother's first aid kit, she began to place the petals one by one. The larger, flatter petals became the soft curve of a cheek. The smaller, more delicate ones became the gentle flutter of eyelashes. She wasn't reviving the flowers. She was giving them a new life, a new purpose. She was creating a portrait. Eleanor would come in during her breaks, bringing Maya a glass of water or a small snack. She would stand by the door, watching her daughter work, her heart a painful mix of pride and fear. She saw the fierce concentration in Maya's eyes, the steady confidence in her hands. In that small, stuffy closet, her daughter wasn't a frightened child playing a rich man's game. She was an artist. On Wednesday afternoon, as Maya was painstakingly arranging the petals to form a soft, smiling mouth, the door to the closet swung open. Both she and Eleanor jumped. Julian Ashworth stood in the doorway, his imposing frame filling the small space. He was holding a tablet, but his eyes were on the work in progress on the table. He looked at the half-finished portrait, his lip curling into a faint, disdainful sneer. "An art project?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "How quaint." "You're making pretty pictures from my garbage." Maya's hand froze over the board. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to look away from her work. "It's not garbage," she said quietly. "It's just changed." Julian let out a short, sharp laugh. "It's dead, child. Its purpose is to be thrown away. You can glue it to a board, you can put it in a frame, but you can't change what it is. It's a lesson you do well to learn." He didn't wait for a response. He just shook his head, a look of smug pity on his face, and walked away, leaving the heavy silence to rush back in. For a moment, Maya's confidence wavered. His words were like acid, trying to eat away at her creation. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was just a stupid kid playing with trash. She looked at the portrait. It was her mother. The likeness was soft, impressionistic, made of fragile, dead things. But it was her. It was her mother's kind eyes, her gentle smile. It was a face made of love and memory. Eleanor knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her back. "Don't listen to him, sweetie," she whispered, her voice fierce. "What you are doing is beautiful. He's the one who can't see." Her mother's words were the shield she needed. Maya took a deep breath and picked up the tweezers again. She placed another petal. And another. His blindness wasn't her problem. Her job was just to make him see. By Friday morning, it was finished. They had placed the poster board into the polished frame, and the glass gave the petal mosaic a surprising depth and sheen. The portrait was breathtaking. It was a soft, sepia-toned image of Eleanor, her head tilted slightly, a gentle, resilient smile on her lips. It was a face that radiated warmth and strength. At the bottom, on a small strip of white paper, Maya had written a title in her neatest cursive. They propped it up against the wall of the utility closet and stood back, looking at it together. 4 days of fear, anxiety, and painstaking work had been poured into this one object. It was more than just a picture. It was their answer. It was their hope. "It's beautiful, Maya," Eleanor whispered, tears welling in her eyes. She pulled her daughter into a fierce hug. "No matter what he says, you should be so proud of what you made." Maya hugged her back, burying her face in her mother's uniform. She was proud. But as the clock on the wall ticked closer to 5, a cold knot of dread began to tighten in her stomach. It was beautiful to them, but would it have any value to a man who had a heart made of stone? At precisely 5 o'clock, the intercom on the kitchen wall buzzed, the sound sharp and jarring. "My office! Both of you! Bring the project!" Julian's voice was cold and clipped, devoid of any emotion. Eleanor's hand flew to her heart. She looked at Maya, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and encouragement. "Okay," she whispered. "It's time." Maya took a deep, shaky breath. Together they carried the framed portrait from the utility closet. It felt heavy, not just from the weight of the wood and glass, but from the weight of their future. Walking through the opulent living room toward the office felt like the longest walk of Maya's life. Each step echoed on the marble, a countdown to the verdict. Julian Ashworth was seated behind his massive, dark mahogany desk. The desk was a fortress, and he was its king. He didn't rise when they entered. He simply steepled his fingers and watched them, his expression unreadable. He gestured to a single, empty spot on the wall opposite his desk. "There, place it there." A brass picture hook was already in the wall, as if he had prepared the stage for her potential failure. Eleanor carefully hung the portrait. Against the stark white wall, under the recessed lighting, the piece seemed to come alive. The soft, faded colors of the petals gave the portrait a timeless, ethereal quality. The image of her mother's gentle, smiling face filled the cold, sterile office with an unexpected warmth. For a long moment, Julian said nothing. He just stared at it, his head tilted slightly. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. "So," he finally said, his voice flat, "this is your argument? You've glued my dead flowers into a picture of your mother. Explain to me how this has value." Maya stepped forward, her hands clasped behind her back to keep them from shaking. She met his gaze directly. "You said the flowers were worthless because they were dead," she began, her voice clearer and stronger than she expected. "But you were wrong. They weren't worthless. They were just finished with being flowers." She took a breath and pointed to the portrait. "Their value didn't disappear. It just changed. I didn't create something from nothing. I just took the beauty that was already there and put it somewhere else. The beauty of the shapes, the colors, the memories of what they used to be." She paused, then delivered the line she had practiced in her head all morning. "I call it beauty in what survives." Julian's eyes flickered from Maya to the portrait and back again. He leaned back in his chair, a look of profound skepticism on his face. But behind the mask of disdain, something else was happening. He was a man who understood acquisitions, who knew how to spot an undervalued asset. And what he was looking at was a masterclass in transformation. He saw the incredible intricacy of the work, the thousands of tiny petals placed with artistic precision. He saw the raw emotion captured in the image. It was a piece of art that would stop anyone in their tracks. It was anything but worthless, and it had been made from his trash. "Sentiment," he scoffed, though the word lacked its usual conviction. "You've created sentiment. It has emotional value to you, perhaps. But in the real world, sentiment doesn't pay the bills. It has no objective, monetary worth." He was trying to regain control, to twist the definition of value to fit his game. "That's not true," Maya countered, growing bolder. "People buy art all the time, and they buy it because of how it makes them feel. You have paintings in your living room worth millions of dollars. You don't own them because you need them to survive. You own them for how they make you feel, or how you want other people to feel when they see them." A nerve twitched in Julian's jaw. A 12-year-old girl was lecturing him on the nature of value, and he couldn't find a flaw in her logic. He stared at the portrait on the wall, at the smiling face of the woman who cleaned his floors, rendered in the husks of his discarded decorations. He had intended to teach this child a lesson in cynical realism. Instead, she had cornered him with a lesson in profound truth. He was silent for a full minute, the only sound in the room the faint hum of the building's ventilation. Eleanor held her breath, her knuckles white as she gripped her hands together. Finally, Julian let out a slow, quiet breath. He looked at Maya, and for the first time, the mocking amusement was gone, replaced by a cold, grudging respect. "You are a clever child," he said, the words sounding like they were being pulled from him against his will. "You found a loophole in my premise. You have, by the narrowest of margins, fulfilled the terms of the challenge." Eleanor felt a wave of dizziness, of pure, unadulterated relief. They had done it. Maya had done it. "Your mother's employment is secure," Julian continued, his voice returning to its familiar, commanding tone. "For now." He reached under his desk and pulled out a dusty banker's box, placing it on the polished surface with a heavy thud. It was sealed with old, yellowed tape. "But the game is not over. Your success this week has simply raised the stakes." He gestured to the box. "Your next challenge. No sentiment this time. No artistic loopholes. This is business." He tapped the top of the box. "In this box are the corporate files, the schematics, the marketing plans, every piece of paper related to the Ashworth Nova." It was a robotics venture my father launched in the late 90s. It was his first major project as CEO, and it was a catastrophic failure. It cost the company millions and nearly bankrupted him. It is, to this day, the single greatest stain on my family's legacy. It is the epitome of worthlessness. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Maya's. "Find the value in my father's greatest failure," he commanded. "You have until next Friday." The relief that had washed over Eleanor in Julian's office evaporated the moment the door clicked shut behind them. It was a cruel, fleeting victory. She felt like a swimmer who had fought her way to the surface for a single gasp of air, only to be dragged back down into the crushing depths. They carried the heavy, dusty box to the utility closet in silence. It felt 10 times heavier than the portrait. Maya placed her hand on the lid, the old cardboard gritty beneath her fingers. This challenge felt different. Colder. The orchids were about beauty. This box was about failure. It felt personal to him, which made it far more dangerous for them. "What are we going to do?" Eleanor whispered, sinking onto one of the small stools. "Maya, this is crazy." "These are just old papers, financial reports, technical drawings. How can we possibly find value in a failed company?" "I don't know yet," Maya admitted, her voice quiet. She peeled back the yellowed tape and lifted the flaps. A musty smell of old paper and forgotten ambitions filled the small closet. The box was packed to the brim with files, folders, and stacks of documents held together by rusted paper clips. For the first 2 days, the task felt utterly hopeless. They sorted through piles of what seemed like corporate garbage. There were glossy marketing brochures for the Ashworth Nova, a sleek, silver robot that looked like something out of a 90s sci-fi movie. The taglines promised to revolutionize the home, but the financial reports told a different story. A story of massive losses and missed deadlines, written in columns of unforgiving red ink. Then there were the schematics, pages and pages of complex diagrams filled with technical jargon that neither of them could understand. It was a graveyard of a failed dream, and Julian had sent them in to be the undertakers. By Wednesday evening, Eleanor was ready to give up. "This is pointless," she said, rubbing her tired eyes. "He knew we couldn't do this. He's just drawing it out, making us sift through his family's trash before he throws us out with it." Maya didn't respond. She was holding a thin blue folder, one she hadn't seen before. It had fallen out from between 2 larger binders. It wasn't labeled with the official Ashworth Nova branding. In fact, it had no label at all. Inside, the papers were older, some of the notes handwritten. The schematics were different too, more like sketches, filled with a creative energy the sterile official blueprints lacked. "Mom, look at this," Maya said, her voice filled with a new curiosity. She pointed to a signature at the bottom of a particularly elegant sketch of a robotic joint. The handwriting was a graceful, looping script. I can't read this first name, but the last name looks like... Hayes. Eleanor froze. She slowly took the folder from Maya, her hands trembling slightly. She stared at the signature. The first name was smudged, but the last name was unmistakable. Hayes, her last name. Her father's last name. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice a choked whisper. "It was just in the box," Maya said, watching her mother's face, which had gone pale. Eleanor sank onto the stool beside her, the file open in her lap. She traced the signature with her finger. "I can't believe it," she murmured. "After all these years." "Mom? What is it?" Maya asked, her heart beginning to beat faster. Eleanor looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Maya," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "I've never told you much about your grandfather, my dad. He passed away when you were just a baby. His name was Arthur Hayes." She looked back down at the elegant signature. "And he was an engineer." A brilliant one. The story tumbled out of her, a long-dammed river of memory and pain finally breaking free. Arthur Hayes had been a genius, a man who saw the world in terms of elegant solutions and beautiful mechanics. He had gotten a job at Ashworth Industries right out of college, full of big dreams. His dream project, the one he poured his heart into, was a home robotic system he called the Butler. He believed it could genuinely help people, especially the elderly and disabled. "He was a junior engineer," Eleanor said, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "But he was the brains of the project. He trusted Julian's father, the first Mr. Ashworth. He thought he had found a mentor. He showed him everything, all his designs, all his notes." She trailed off, her jaw tightening. "Then, one day he was fired. They accused him of stealing company secrets, which was ridiculous. The secrets were all his. They pushed him out, made him sign a non-disclosure agreement that ruined his reputation. 6 months later, Ashworth Industries announced the Ashworth Nova. It was my father's robot, Maya. They stole his dream. They stole his life's work." Maya stared at her, horrified. "But Mr. Ashworth said it was a failure." "Because they didn't understand it," Eleanor said, a bitter anger in her voice. "My dad used to say they were trying to build a race car by reading the manual for a toaster. They had his designs, but they didn't have his vision. They cut corners, used cheaper materials, and misunderstood the core principles of his programming. They turned his elegant, helpful butler into a clumsy, expensive toy. Of course it failed. They had stolen the body, but they had left the soul behind." A heavy silence filled the closet. The musty smell of old paper now seemed like the smell of injustice. This box wasn't Julian Ashworth's shame. It was their family's stolen legacy. Maya looked from the elegant sketches in the blue folder to the glossy, failed marketing brochures. It was all there. The proof. The story of a great man who had been cheated and erased from his own creation. The game had changed. This was no longer about finding a loophole to keep a job. This was about reclaiming a history, about fighting for a ghost. Maya looked at her mother, whose face was a mixture of old grief and new, burning anger. A fire lit in Maya's own heart. Julian Ashworth had given them this box to prove its worthlessness. He had no idea what he had just handed them. The rest of the week was a blur of focused, feverish activity. The small utility closet was no longer a workshop of hope, but a war room. The dusty box of files had transformed from a symbol of failure into a chest of evidence. Maya and Eleanor were no longer just mother and daughter. They were detectives, piecing together the ghost of a man they had both lost. With Eleanor's memories as their guide, the cryptic documents began to make sense. They laid out Arthur Hayes's original, elegant designs from the blue folder and compared them, piece by piece, to the clunky, complicated corporate blueprints for the Ashworth Nova. "Look," Eleanor would say, her voice sharp with anger as she pointed to a diagram. Dad designed this arm with a magnetic servo drive. It was quiet and fluid. They replaced it with a cheaper hydraulic system. That's why the test reports all complain about the noise and jerky movements. It was all there, a trail of arrogant, cost-cutting decisions. Memos from the elder Mr. Ashworth demanded faster production and cheaper parts, ignoring the detailed warnings in the margins written in Arthur Hayes's elegant script. They had taken a symphony and turned it into a cacophony. They hadn't just stolen a design, they had butchered it. By Thursday afternoon, they had a clear, damning picture of the theft and the subsequent failure. But Maya knew it wasn't enough. Julian Ashworth was not a man to be moved by historical injustice. Proving his father was a thief might be satisfying, but it wouldn't win them the game. To him, it would still be a story about a worthless, failed project. The value had to be here, now. That evening, as Maya was leaving the closet to get a glass of water, she passed the open door to Julian's office. He was on the phone, his back to her, pacing in front of the great window. His voice was sharp with a frustration she had never heard before. "No, that's not an acceptable margin of error," he snapped into his phone. "The predictive algorithm is still unstable. It's misinterpreting user intent 80% of the time. The launch is in 2 weeks. Fix it." He slammed the phone down and ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time she had ever seen. He stared at a complex, glowing diagram on a massive screen on his wall, a look of pure fury on his face. Maya froze in the hallway, her heart starting to pound. She recognized what was on the screen. It was a neural network map, the kind they had studied in her advanced science club. It was part of an AI, and it was deeply flawed. She could see the chaotic feedback loops from the doorway. She had seen something similar in her grandfather's notes. She hurried back to the closet, her mind racing. "Mom, what's Mr. Ashworth's big new project? The one he's working on now?" "Some kind of new AI system, I think," Eleanor said, looking up from a financial report. "They call it Oracle. It's supposed to be a revolutionary personal assistant." "Why?" Maya didn't answer. She started digging frantically through the blue folder, her hands flying through her grandfather's old notes. She wasn't looking at the robotic hardware anymore. She was looking at the theory, the programming concepts. And then she found it. It was a single, hand-typed page, a conceptual outline titled The Empathy Algorithm. It wasn't code. It was a theory, a revolutionary idea about how an AI could be designed not just to respond to commands, but to predict a user's intent by learning their patterns of behavior. It was about creating a symbiotic relationship between human and machine. In the margins, her grandfather had scribbled notes. "The key is not a perfect logic, but an adaptive intuition. It must learn to guess, to feel." The elder Mr. Ashworth, a man of brute force and simple mechanics, would have seen this page as philosophical nonsense. He had wanted a robot that could carry a tray, not one that could feel. He had thrown the soul away. Maya's hands trembled as she held the paper. Julian Ashworth's multi-billion-dollar AI was failing because it was unstable, because it couldn't understand human intent. His team of world-class engineers was trying to solve the problem with logic, with more processing power. But her grandfather had solved it 50 years ago, with a different kind of logic, with empathy. The value of the failed Ashworth Nova wasn't in the past. It wasn't a story of injustice. It was the answer to Julian Ashworth's billion-dollar problem. The key to his future was right here, in this dusty, forgotten box. On Friday afternoon, as the clock ticked towards 5, Maya carefully placed the empathy algorithm paper on top of a small, neat stack of evidence. The key schematics, the damning memos, her grandfather's original sketches. The power had shifted. They weren't walking into Julian's office as a maid and her daughter, begging for their jobs. They were walking in holding the key to his empire. Eleanor looked at her daughter, at the quiet, unshakable confidence in her eyes. The fear that had lived in her heart for weeks was finally being replaced by a fierce, burning pride. "Are you ready?" Eleanor asked. Maya nodded, clutching the papers. "He wanted us to find the value in his father's greatest failure," she said, a small, determined smile on her face. "I think we're about to show him." The buzz of the intercom was the same, but this time it did not spark fear. It was a starting gun. Eleanor and Maya looked at each other, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. It was time. They walked into Julian Ashworth's office, not with the trepidation of a week ago, but with the solemn purpose of ambassadors arriving for a treaty negotiation. The box of files remained in the closet. Maya carried only a single, slim folder. Julian was leaning against his desk, arms crossed, the picture of casual power. A smug, expectant look was on his face. He clearly anticipated a rambling, sentimental presentation he could easily tear apart. "Friday, 5 o'clock, he said, a mocking lilt in his voice. "The suspense is killing me. Did you find a forgotten paperclip worth 5 cents? Tell me, Maya, what is the great value you've uncovered in the Ashworth family's epic failure?" Maya did not answer immediately. She walked to the large, polished desk and carefully laid out the first 2 documents from her folder. One of her grandfather's original fluid sketches of the robot's arm, and the clunky, over-engineered corporate blueprint that had replaced it. "The Ashworth Nova didn't fail because it was a bad idea," Maya began, her voice steady and clear. "It failed because it wasn't an Ashworth idea at all. It was stolen." Julian's smirk faltered. He pushed himself off the desk, his eyes narrowing. "What did you say?" "The real inventor of the robot was a junior engineer named Arthur Hayes," Maya continued, her voice gaining strength. She pointed to the elegant signature on the sketch, "My grandfather." She proceeded to lay out the evidence with methodical precision. She showed him the memos where his father had dismissed his grandfather's warnings. She showed him the timeline, how Arthur Hayes was fired on trumped-up charges just weeks before the project was publicly announced under the Ashworth name. Julian's face went from disbelief to a dark, rising anger. "This is absurd," he snarled, stepping forward. "You've concocted some fantasy, a desperate lie to try and win this pathetic game. My father was a visionary. Your grandfather was a nobody, a disgruntled employee." "My grandfather was a genius," Eleanor cut in, her voice ringing with a lifetime of suppressed anger. "And your father was a thief. He ruined him. He ruined our family. This box you think is so worthless is the proof." "Proof of nothing," Julian roared, his carefully constructed composure finally shattering. He swept his arm across the desk, intending to send the papers flying. "This is over. Get out of my office. Get out of my building. Is the Oracle project over too?" Maya's question, spoken quietly into a storm of fury, stopped him cold. His arm froze mid-air. He turned to her slowly, his face a mask of shock and confusion. "What do you know about that?" he whispered, his voice suddenly stripped of its power. "I know the predictive algorithm is unstable," Maya said, her gaze unwavering. "It's misinterpreting user intent, and your launch is in 2 weeks. The blood drained from Julian's face. He stared at her as if she were a ghost. It was his company's most guarded secret, a catastrophic failure point that was giving him sleepless nights. How could she possibly know? Maya slid the final single sheet of paper across the desk toward him. It was the hand-typed page with the handwritten notes in the margin. "Your father and my grandfather both worked with robots," Maya said. "But they were building different things. Your father was building a machine. My grandfather was trying to build a friend." Julian looked down at the paper. He read the title, "The Empathy Algorithm." "Your Oracle AI is failing because you're trying to solve a human problem with machine logic," Maya explained, her voice softening. "You're trying to make it smarter. But my grandfather knew it needed to be wiser. He believed an AI needed to learn how to guess what a person wanted, how to understand their feelings, not just their words. He wrote that the key wasn't perfect logic, but adaptive intuition." Julian sank into his massive leather chair, his eyes glued to the page. He read the words of the man his father had destroyed, and in them saw the answer to the problem that his own team of geniuses couldn't solve. He saw the elegant, revolutionary solution that had been buried for decades in a box he considered garbage. The value of the failed project wasn't historical. It wasn't about justice or sentiment. It was a tangible, priceless key. The key to saving his company, his reputation, and his own legacy. He looked up from the paper, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. Shock, shame, and a dawning, incredulous awe. He looked at the maid he had humiliated and the 12-year-old girl he had tormented. They hadn't just won his game. They had transcended it completely. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted. It had been completely and irrevocably inverted. He was no longer the king holding court. He was the beggar, and the child before him was holding the only thing in the world that could save him. For a long time, Julian Ashworth said nothing. He sat in his chair, staring at the single sheet of paper as if it were a verdict. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. He, a titan of industry, a man who moved markets with a word, had been brought to his knees by a ghost from a dusty box and the unwavering gaze of a 12-year-old girl. His entire life had been a race to surpass his father's legacy, to build an empire so vast it would eclipse the memory of the man who had taught him that compassion was a weakness and victory was the only thing that mattered. Now he was staring at the truth. The foundation of that legacy was rotten, and his own future, the one he was trying to build, was dependent on correcting that original sin. He slowly lifted his eyes from the paper and looked at Eleanor and Maya. He didn't see a maid and her daughter anymore. He saw the keepers of a truth that could either destroy him or save him. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice raspy, stripped of all its former arrogance. It was the sound of complete and utter surrender. It was Eleanor who answered, her voice trembling but strong. "I want my father's name back," she said, her chin high. "I want the world to know who Arthur Hayes was, not for money, not for revenge, for the truth." Maya took a small step forward. "You have a choice," she said, her voice soft but clear. "The launch for your AI is in 2 weeks. You can use my grandfather's idea, and maybe it will work. You can take the credit for yourself, just like your father did. And you can keep living a lie." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Or you can tell the truth, and maybe build something that's actually worth something." She wasn't making a demand. She was offering him a lifeline. The choice was his. 2 weeks later, the grand ballroom of the Ashworth Tower was filled to capacity. Tech journalists, investors, and industry titans mingled under crystal chandeliers, sipping champagne and waiting for the unveiling of the Oracle AI. The buzz in the room was electric. Julian Ashworth was known for his dramatic, game-changing presentations, and tonight was expected to be his masterpiece. Backstage, in a small, private viewing room, Eleanor and Maya watched the crowd on a monitor. Eleanor wore a simple but elegant dark blue dress, one Julian had insisted on providing. Maya stood beside her, looking out of place but unafraid in her best school dress. They hadn't seen Julian since that day in his office. He had simply said, "Be here." 7 p.m. They had no idea what he was about to do. "I'm scared, Mom," Maya whispered, clutching Eleanor's hand. "Me too," Eleanor whispered back, squeezing her daughter's fingers. "But whatever happens, I am so proud of you." At precisely 8 o'clock, the lights in the ballroom dimmed. A single spotlight hit the center of the stage. Julian Ashworth walked out to a thunderous applause. He looked different. He wore a simple dark suit, not his usual flashy attire. His face was pale, and the trademark arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a somber gravity. He walked to the podium, but he didn't touch the keyboard to start the presentation. He looked out at the silent, expectant crowd. "Good evening," he began, his voice quiet but clear, amplified throughout the massive hall. "Tonight, I was supposed to unveil the future, a revolutionary I called Oracle. But I can't do that, because the future of this company must begin with the truth about its past. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. The story of Ashworth Industries, as many of you know, began with my father, Julian continued, his eyes fixed on a point at the back of the room. He was considered a visionary, a titan, but the first major project of his career, a robotics venture called the Ashworth Nova, was a catastrophic failure. What no one knew, what I did not know until 2 weeks ago, is that it failed because it was built on a lie. He took a deep breath. The Ashworth Nova was not my father's invention. He stole it. He stole it from a brilliant visionary young engineer named Arthur Hayes. He took his genius, pushed him out of the company, and ruined his reputation. He then mismanaged the project into the ground. Gasps of shock echoed through the ballroom. Journalists were scrambling, typing furiously. "I stand here tonight," Julian said, his voice thick with an emotion no one had ever heard from him before. Not as the CEO of a great company, but as the son of a man who committed a great injustice, an injustice that has haunted this company for decades. He looked directly into the main camera. "The Oracle project is being postponed because we have discovered that the key to its success lies in the original, untainted work of Arthur Hayes, a genius who was 50 years ahead of his time. He then did something no one expected, but I did not discover this truth. It was brought to me by his granddaughter, a 12-year-old girl named Maya Hayes." He turned and gestured towards the side of the stage. A spotlight operator, confused but following orders, swung a light toward the private viewing room. "Tonight is not about me," Julian announced, his voice ringing with conviction. "It's about setting the record straight. Therefore, Ashworth Industries is immediately establishing the Arthur Hayes Foundation for Ethical Innovation, an independent trust with an initial endowment of $500 million to fund young engineers who, like Arthur, dream of building a better world." He looked towards the viewing room, his eyes finding Eleanor and Maya through the glass. And for the first time, they saw not a billionaire, not a monster, but just a man, humbled and broken, trying to clean up a mess that had been left for him. "I am sorry," he said, the words directed not to the crowd, but to them. "I am profoundly and truly sorry." He stepped back from the podium, the applause hesitant at first, then growing into a roar of astonishment. Backstage, Eleanor finally let the tears fall, tears of vindication, of relief, of a lifetime of pain finally being washed away. Maya watched the man on the stage, the man who had spilled wine to humiliate her mother, now humiliating himself before the world to reclaim a piece of his own soul. He had regretted it, after all. He had regretted it all. The world outside the private viewing room erupted into a chaotic symphony of camera flashes and reporters shouting questions. But inside, a profound quiet had fallen. Eleanor stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, her daughter's hand held tightly in hers. The public vindication of her father was a moment she had never, in her wildest dreams, allowed herself to imagine. A moment later, the door opened. It was Julian. His face was pale and drawn, but his eyes were clear for the first time. He didn't speak. He just looked at them, his expression a raw mixture of shame and a deep, soul-shaking relief. Eleanor was the first to find her voice. "My father," she said, her voice choked with tears. "He would have been so proud." "He would have been proud of his granddaughter," Julian said quietly, his gaze shifting to Maya. "She has his courage and his integrity." He took a step closer, not as a boss, but as an equal. "What I did on that stage, it was just words. The real work starts now. The foundation needs a director, someone to ensure that its mission, his mission, is honored. I can't think of anyone more qualified than his daughter." Eleanor stared at him, stunned. "Me? But I was your maid." "You are Arthur Hayes' daughter," Julian corrected her gently. "That makes you the guardian of his legacy. The position is yours, if you'll accept it. It will come with a salary that reflects its importance, and a lifetime pension that was denied to your father. It wasn't an offer of charity. It was an act of restitution. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change. The press called Julian Ashworth's public confession the reckoning, an unprecedented act of corporate honesty. The company's stock stumbled, then soared as a new wave of investors, drawn by his radical integrity, bought in. Julian, true to his word, stepped down as CEO, appointing a successor while he took on a new role. Chief Product Officer, personally overseeing the ethical redevelopment of the Oracle AI, now co-credited to its original inventor, Arthur Hayes. Eleanor and Maya moved out of their cramped apartment and into a beautiful house in a quiet, leafy suburb, a home with a small garden where Eleanor began to plant flowers. She accepted the position as the executive director of the Arthur Hayes Foundation. She blossomed in the role, her quiet diligence and fierce integrity earning her the respect of everyone she worked with. She was no longer a ghost polishing a billionaire's furniture. She was a leader, building a future for hundreds of young engineers in her father's name. The first person to receive the foundation's full scholarship was a brilliant girl from a low-income neighborhood who dreamed of designing prosthetics. At the award ceremony, Maya stood beside her mother on the stage, a symbol of the foundation's core belief that genius can be found anywhere, and value is often hidden in the places the world has taught us not to look. About a year after that first terrible day, Julian invited them back to the penthouse. The cold, sterile space had changed. It was warmer, the furniture rearranged to feel more like a home than a museum. And there, on the main wall of the living room, in the most prominent spot, hung the portrait of Eleanor, made from the petals of dead orchids. "It reminds me every day," Julian said, standing beside Maya as they looked at it. "It reminds me of what real value looks like." He had changed, too. The sharp, arrogant edges had been smoothed away, replaced by a quiet humility. He and Maya would sometimes play chess, and he would listen, truly listen, to her ideas about the world. He was still a billionaire, still one of the most powerful men in the world, but he was no longer a king. He was just a man. That evening, the three of them sat down to eat, not as a boss and his employees, but as a strange, unlikely family, forged in the fires of a shared history. The silence was not one of fear, but of a comfortable, easy peace. Julian Ashworth had once deliberately spilled wine to humiliate a woman he thought was beneath him. But her daughter, a girl armed with nothing but courage and a belief in the beauty of broken things, had made him see the truth. She taught him that the deepest stains aren't the ones on the floor, but the ones on the soul. And she had shown him that it's never too late to clean them up. This story is a powerful reminder that dignity isn't determined by a person's job title or their bank account. It's something that lives inside us all. Maya's simple, unwavering courage in the face of immense power changed everything, not just for her family, but for the man who tried to break them. It makes you wonder how many quiet heroes we overlook every day. So, while you're here, I'd love to know what you think. Who was the bigger hero in this story? Maya, or the man who had the courage to publicly admit his wrongs? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Like this video if you believe that one person's voice can truly change the world, and subscribe for more stories that prove the most valuable things in life are the ones that can't be bought.